Hi. I can't keep starting all my videos by just saying hello. I need a catchphrase. Sup? Oh, hey. Didn't see you there. I don't know. Maybe that works. In one of my last videos, I ended up having in the background one of my images that I did for Legends of Runeterra. I got a couple people that said that they really liked it. And I think I got a comment or two asking if I could talk about my Legends of Runeterra work. So I thought, you know what? That sounds like a great video. Let's do just that. As you will soon find out, things did not go according to plan when it came to working for Legends of Runeterra. But it's not the only client. I really like sharing this story because I feel like in sharing my stories where I've messed up when working for different clients or turning in art for somebody, I feel like other artists can hopefully learn from my mistakes and the things that I've had to learn over time. So I thought I'd not just talk about Legends of Runeterra and the work I did for them, so I thought I'd also talk about some of my other client experiences that didn't go so great. And hopefully you guys can, take something from my failures. I do want to express that in this video, I take full responsibility for any of the things that happened poorly for any of those clients. I think there's a lot of people that can kind of pin the blame on the clients or art directors for not seeing their particular vision. And I'll be honest, guys, I just wasn't good enough most of the time. But I won't get into specifics here. I'll hop over to my computer and I'll show you guys what happened. Here we are at my computer. So I mentioned that this isn't just going to be about Legends of Runeterra. This is going to be going over 3 stories of past, flunkings, failures, embarrassments, etc. that I've personally experienced when working for a client. And I wanted this to be kind of a wide range between my experiences. So this first one is earlier on in my freelancing days. It was before I was full-time freelance. It was just before I went full-time, but a little bit before then. So I was still fairly new. I hadn't worked for many super large clients outside of working directly for outsourced studios and stuff. Anyone that's watched my video on how I became a professional artist, you can go watch that for more details of what that saga was like, I guess. But this first client I wanted to talk about is actually a small client that was working on a Kickstarter. The Kickstarter was for a project called UltraCoin. This Amazon woman was the first image that I did for them. I feel like it was pretty successful at fulfilling whatever the client was asking. And as far as I can remember, there wasn't really any problems with this design. They liked that I turned in these designs. They liked that I did thumbnail images for them of different poses. And the quality bar was being met as I was getting towards a final image. This was the second image that I did for them. I guess it titled Undead Lord. I don't really know what it ended up being called. This one had a few more hiccups. The posing was kind of awkward. I think the client had requested to have like hand raised above head about to swing a mace, but it made it really difficult with this like kind of cramped aspect ratio and the framing itself of being kind of rounded in a coin. And so it's not a problem with the aspect ratio necessarily. It's just that I wasn't experienced enough to be able to figure out how to make this work within this type of a frame. This was the area that I started seeing some problems. I sent this in and I do remember there was a lot of back and forth, like the whole handle on the mace was like too thin and the grip didn't feel like tight enough. The foreshortening was kind of awkward. It didn't seem like they were really actually lifting the thing up. It kind of felt like their like torso was just sort of stationary and not lifting up with the mace as it should have been lifted up. And it felt like there wasn't a really solid angle to see this like cool shoulder piece. So I remember kind of some feedback coming in and the client not being super satisfied, but they were fine with it. They just kind of had some bits of feedback about it over time. This third image that I did was called the Gold Dragon, and this was the real problem. This was actually like a pretty big blow to my ego around this time. I think right off the bat, the design was something that wasn't as solid as maybe the client was hoping for. It's something I also was kind of hoping for, something a little bit more solid. I wasn't really doing a lot of creatures at this time, and so I didn't feel super comfortable working in this. I really wanted to do a lot of creatures. I felt like it was a really fun brief and a really cool assignment. I really wanted to work on a dragon. The problem was that like I only had so much time to work on this. So if this were my only client, then I would have been fine. But this was right as I was starting to get into my full-time freelancing. So I had to suddenly take on, I think it was like 5 Pathfinder images. I started working on this final image for UltraCoin. And I think I was working for maybe like 2 other clients. So there was a lot of work on my plate, and I didn't really have a whole lot of time to dedicate to this one assignment to make sure that I was like practicing dragon anatomy, you know, whatever that is, right? Or making the anatomy look like realistic animal anatomy. So it was already pretty bumpy, like right off the start. But I think the client generally liked the thumbnail images from what I remember. They ended up going with the center one. And this was the color sketch that was turned in. And I think at this point, like the client just kind of trusted me with like, yeah, okay, like you do your thing. You render it, and it'll look good in the end. I think they were concerned about making sure that it was going to pop off value-wise from the background, because in here you can kind of see that the head and the neck are kind of just blending in with that background color. Other than that, I don't think there's a whole lot of complaints about this particular sketch that I sent in. And then I sent in this as, I think this was like my proposed final. And it's hard to kind of look at this as a proposed final, honestly, in hindsight. There's a lot of things that now I'm a significantly better artist. There's a lot of things that I would change about this, but it's also just more obvious to me now why the client wasn't as satisfied with this image. If I open this in Photoshop, you can kind of see how there's a lot of issues just with the anatomy and the forms in general. Everything feels very, very flat. There's not really a whole lot of depth to it. Now, if I were to go back, I would definitely imply a lot more depth with the wing. I'd make sure that the anatomy was more solid, actually connecting into a place in the back instead of like in the very back of the neck right here. Probably pushing that down. There's a whole lot of things I'd do. This whole wing is like really, really flat, so that needs to definitely have some more depth, some more dimension, make it go back into the background some more. It doesn't really feel like it's gold. I remember that kind of being one of the points of feedback, is that it just felt like it was very yellow and there wasn't really enough like shininess to the scales. It really actually had to feel like it was a gold dragon with golden scales. So I'd probably end up sort of creating a much more neutral, like orangish pattern on it, and then having the scales sort of, you know, pop off with some brighter highlights that's a little bit more reflective than I have in this current version. So there's a lot of little changes. It would probably need a whole overhaul to really be something that I'd be satisfied with now, but I can absolutely see why the client wasn't satisfied with this based off of the quality bar that I'd been previously going into. I think at this stage, the client was still kind of nice about it though. And they were like, yeah, you know, this is fine, but I think there's some feedback I have. So I kept trying to address the feedback, and you can see here, I'm trying to address that feedback of the values not really popping off against the background. I'm trying to address the feedback of the shininess of the scales. The fact that like all these forms are like not really defined. So I'm starting to try and add in that like separation of light and shadow, which I talk about a lot right now. And I feel pretty confident being able to implement that into my images now. But at this time, I was just sort of just learning these aspects of image making. So I didn't feel really that comfortable putting it into this image and like really making it work under any sort of lighting scenario. And then finally, I think I just like didn't really know what to do. Darkened a bunch of the values, ended up kind of giving up on the whole chest anatomy here because I, you know, didn't know what the anatomy was supposed to look like. I think this maybe is when I kind of looked up some reference of like lion anatomy, because there's this sort of like flap that they have in between with that's like skin to the pectoral muscle. And I think I was trying to implement that, but that was not successful at all. The reason that I had this as this first major blunder is just because this was the first time that I think a client was actually really honest with me about my quality bar that I set. Most of the time, if you're working for clients, if you don't do super well, the client just doesn't hire you again. And they, you know, maybe they'll make up kind of some sort of a soft excuse and say like, oh, we're like transitioning, we're going a different direction, you know, or whatever. But this was the first client that I think actually just tried to say in a really respectful way, like, I'm sorry, but I'm not satisfied with the quality of this based off of your past work and based off of the expectations that I set. And I think it bothered me at the time because I wasn't really used to hearing that, but it definitely was like a big reality check for me. And moving forward for the rest of that year, I just like, this was always in the back of my mind, like, man, I really don't want to disappoint the next client that I end up having. And honestly, looking at the work, it's like 100% understandable why the client wasn't satisfied with this result. So the next story is about actually my first ever brief that I got from Magic the Gathering. This was rough for me. I think in hindsight, when I look back on it, it wasn't actually as bad as I remember it being. It just is such a huge bummer when, you get this client that I'd been wanting to work for Magic at this point, probably for like 8 to 10 years, something like that. And, you always imagine like you want to give it your all. You want to try your best. You don't want to fail. You want to make sure that like you end up getting more work from them. And so any sort of small blunder or small hiccup is just like a huge blow. Like I said, I think in hindsight, it wasn't that bad, but it definitely had me nervous for getting hired and brought on again. So anyone that maybe is familiar with Magic, if you follow my other channel that I'm on, Distraction Makers on YouTube, where I talk about game design with my friend Gavin, and we talk about Magic the Gathering all the time. And like, if you guys want to listen to me talk about Magic the Gathering, I talk about Magic the Gathering a lot. But if you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, you'd be familiar with this card. This card is Hex Drinker. But yes, let's talk about what ended up going wrong with this image. So for context, for those that don't know how it works with Magic the Gathering, they're a pretty loose client working for Wizards is. Most of the time, they just kind of want to see a sketch, and especially if there's color involved. Once that sketch is approved, you can just go and finish the image if you feel comfortable with that. Some artists like to check in and have a little bit more feedback or input from the art directors to make sure they're going in a good direction. And I did that. I was used to sending in multiple steps. I didn't send in as many steps as I normally do, but I definitely made sure that I sent in a sketch, sent in a color rough, made sure they were happy with that, and then moved on to the final. So these were just some thumbnail sketches that I ended up working on for Hex Drinker. Just really playing around with the idea. I think the brief for this was something like a snake that swallowed a spell and was about to like spit it back out or something, or digest it. And they kind of referenced and talked about snakes that swallowed eggs. And you can find like reference images of snakes when they swallow eggs, how it like stretches their scales out and stuff. Sketching around with different ideas for that, playing around with different sizes. So you can see like a sketch here where, the snake is like huge and it's coiling around a person. Or there's smaller ones, like this one wrapped around a tree branch. I think this is one that I moved forward with. And you can see here some thumbnail sketches with color. So this is the next step that I ended up sending in, where I started to narrow things down a little bit. I started implementing lighting so that they could get a better idea of what this might look like in the end. Obviously, as you've seen, they went with number 1. So after that, though, I ended up sending it in. And you can see this is actually the first final that I ended up sending in for Hex Drinker. And it's way, way brighter. It's way saturated. And it doesn't actually look like a snake is swallowing an egg. If you're not familiar with reference for that, this is basically kind of what it looks like, in that it stretches the skin out and makes it much more translucent. And it's stretching all around. And I basically just kind of drew like some of these like bottom belly scales, stretching all the way up and around. And like you can see here, those belly scales are not stretching at all, but the other areas all around the snake are stretching. And I was just coming off of working on a lot of Smite work, which works with a lot more saturated colors. It's much more splash arty. And so jumping straight from Smite stuff into this was not the direction that Wizards wanted to go in. And so my art director at the time was Cynthia Shepard. And she ended up sending like a big, long, like multi-paragraph email. And she was really, really nice about it. She was really, really great. But she kind of talked to me about like expectations of Magic, what the type of like lighting scenarios, the type of drawings, like the type of setting that they want it to feel. And they want it to feel much more grounded in reality. And so she gave me feedback on the color, on the lighting, on the realism. And It was really great, but man, that was such a hard email to read. I sent this in and I was like really happy with it. I was like so ecstatic. Now I'm looking at it and I'm like cringing, but I was so happy with the results of it and I was so excited to get to work on my first card. And so the minute that they sent that email, I was like, damn, I gotta do something. I gotta make sure that whatever I send in next is gonna be like definitely going to be better. So you can see here, this was like my first attempt at trying to capture more of that realistic look. And the problem is like, I still wasn't really capturing the realism of a snake that was actually like stretching its scales out. And the lighting was a lot better, but it was maybe a little bit too like bright and blue and distracting, and it made it kind of hard to read from a small size. And so if I'm not mistaken, I think they actually sent in a paint over. I think this was their paint over. And the fact that like, not only did they have to give me feedback and then I sent in an update, but that even that update of the proposal like wasn't good enough was just such a huge blow. It was so hard for me to hear that. It was very, very difficult. So I was very apologetic. I told them how much I appreciated the feedback, how much I'd work on it. And I think they were very understanding. I got another brief not long after this. And so, you know, obviously I must have done enough where they were okay with giving me another shot at this. But as you can see, it's way, way closer to what they ended up sending in for their paint over. And I just ended up kind of going through and cleaning it up. And so it still goes along with my original composition. But beyond that, a lot of the work was because of the help from wizards. All right. So finally, we're going to get into Legends of Runeterra and what went wrong with that. What could go wrong, right? So at this point of working with Legends of Runeterra, I'd actually already been working for Magic for, I want to say maybe a year or two at that point. I'd had a lot more experience with client work. I felt like my skills had developed quite a bit with my color and my lighting. My general drawing skills had been improving a little bit. And at this point, I'd actually already done a little bit of work for Riot. So I worked through Wild Blue Studios as an outsourcing studio I worked with for a while. Before I was brought on full-time, they ended up getting the offer to work on Legends of Runeterra. They were essentially sent like a miniature art test in a way to do 3 cards. It was all paid, and it was me and 2 other artists that we all kind of worked on our own cards and then helped each other with each other's cards to, you know, get them across the finish line. And so the card that I was tasked with was this young troll card. Now, early on, there were some hiccups with this image, but overall, this image actually went really well. Like I said, there were some problems just with like composition. So here's some of my early sketches. It's, again, it's really strange for me to go back and look at some of these early sketches because I'd handle things so differently now. I just feel like my drawing skills were not at the same level that they are now. There's a lot of like wobbliness to a lot of this anatomy. There's not a lot of confidence about certain things, certain areas. Some of the information isn't being executed super well. Just little things like that. Even how the storytelling is handled is not as good as it probably could be. So here you can see I'm starting to refine some of this a little bit so that it's easier for the client to understand like what we're aiming for. The client ended up leaning towards this thumbnail in particular, so I started doing some color thumbnails. And again, it's like now I would do color thumbnails so differently. They were fine with these, but the problem with doing the way that I handled them here and how I was kind of doing them around this time was I was using a lot of color layers, a lot of overlay layers, and you just don't get that nuance in color and light when using layer modes. You can, I think, if you're like really, really knowledgeable and really competent with them, but I often find that usually I can point out someone's work and be like, oh, they used color balance here, and like that's why it looks the way that it ends up looking. Normally, like it just, you know, it's tough to say, but I really do think it just comes down to like absolute bare bones, just throwing paint on there and being really, really competent with your color and light skills to show off these different lighting scenarios. So these were pretty basic. I kind of remember them being a little too basic and the client wanted a little bit more variety, but overall, I think it went fine. After that, I ended up working on a sketch. Again, there are some issues, understandably. There's some anatomical problems. Still having that kind of like wobbly anatomy problem going in. It didn't feel like hunched over, so he needed to hunch over. This looked like a banana, which was kind of weird, and it's supposed to look like a sigil for the Avarosin, I think is what they're called. I don't know. And so there was some feedback that needed to be done there. And again, I was getting a little too saturated in here, so I had to bring it back closer to what that initial thumbnail sketch was. But as it got into this portion, I think things started kind of falling into place, and it pretty much was just rendering and making sure I wasn't deviating too far from the initial sketch. And yeah, things ended up going pretty well for this image overall, and the client was pretty happy by the final result. So you're probably wondering, okay, if that image went well, then what's the problem? What ended up going wrong? Well, this is what happened. So that was initially an art test for the studio. Went great. There's a couple hiccups, but overall the client was happy, and they decided to entrust us with a bunch of cards. So not long after that, they asked how many cards we could take on. I think we said like, 10 or something, and they said, you have to take 18. And we said, okay, because that's what we just had to do. If that's how many the client needed to hand to us, then that's what we had to do in order to kind of make the sale in a way. And so what kind of ended up happening is I ended up being handed like a bulk of the cards to work on. So we had about, I think 3 to 4 months, and I was handed 9 illustrations. And so that's already kind of a lot. These images are kind of like soft splash art images, not the same amount of level of detail and care needs to go in as much as like a splash art needs to go into. But most of that, honestly, is just polish. I feel like a lot of these images really rely heavily on having a really, really good composition and initial drawing, and then just a good plan for the color and lighting. And it's okay if it's not as polished as like traditional splash art is, but still a ton of time and care has to go into like those initial stages in order to make sure that as it builds up that it's going to be, a really, really good image. And so having 9 illustrations plus at this point, now I was brought on full time with Wild Blue Studios. And so occasionally other work would come in. And so as other work would come in on the side, we had to make sure that we were kind of doing other stuff. We did like icon work for, Wild Rift. We did little, maybe other bits of illustration work here and there. I don't quite remember exactly the projects. We ended up chunking down exactly how much time we had to work on every step. So when you're working for a studio, especially for an outsourced studio, chances are you're being paid maybe not hourly or for a day rate, but you're being paid on an asset rate when working on an illustration. Most illustration work isn't paid hourly and isn't paid by the day, mostly because it can vary so wildly. There's some people that they'll spend like 100 hours on an illustration, and there's some people that will spend like 25 to 30, and you could get like pretty similar levels of, completion out of those two. So most of the time illustrations are the sort of like middle of the road flat rate. And so when it's a flat rate, you want to make sure that if you're just going to be getting paid this one chunk of money, that you're not overextending your time, right? So you have to kind of look at the flat rate of how much money you're going to be making. If you were to break it down into what you'd be expecting to make for an hourly rate, you want to make sure you're not going above those amount of hours, because otherwise you start kind of burning money in a way. And so I think what we ended up coming down to was, I think I had about 1 week. It was like 1 to 2 weeks for each of those initial steps. So I think it was like 1 week of thumbnails for each card, and then 1 week for like color thumbnails. It might have even been shorter. It might have been about like 3 days or so for like color thumbnails, or 3 days for a thumbnail stage or something like that. And then I think we had maybe like a week or 2 to work on the actual like drawing stage. And then finally we had about 2 to 3 weeks or something like that in order to actually render it and bring it to final. And as much as the first card went well, I still kind of ran into a lot of the same challenges I ran into with the first card, but now with the added pressure of less time. And so you can kind of see this is one of the images that I ended up doing that ended up getting approved. Some of these early compositions, it's definitely stronger than the troll one was, in that you're seeing a lot of the storytelling, you're seeing the camera angle, you're seeing the silhouette and the actions of the characters and stuff. But you can see I'm still kind of doing the same thing with the color thumbnails. It's a lot of simple like color overlay layers. It's not really getting a wide variety of different moods. And really, other than small tinting of colors here and there, you're not really getting like a great range. But as you can see in this sketch, like this environment is really, really bare. And you can also see some of these like early hiccups I was having. Like there's a lot of stuff that's really, really bumpy. It's not really designed super elegantly. It's just sort of made because this is the mask I saw as reference. So I need to create that mask, and it needs to be at this angle in this 3D space. But I'm not really considering what makes something look interesting or aesthetically pleasing. And so that's a really common issue I kind of keep having with a lot of these images. So this is as I'm starting to get into final lines and I start blocking in colors. And like I said, I think this was one of the more successful images. I would show the other ones, but I don't know if that's legal. I don't know if Riot would be mad at me for showing them. So unfortunately, I can't show the ones that weren't approved. I don't want to say they were significantly lower of a quality. I think they were probably similar quality. I do feel like most of my images just sort of skated by what their quality bar was. And so the drawing is looking better. There's still a lot of issues I have with drawing at this time. Again, like wobbly anatomy. I'm not really thinking about design of anatomy or like interest of silhouette as much as I'm just trying to make it look right or correct. And that's a really big problem. But the overall like color that's blocked in is fine. But the other issue that I ran into a lot around this time is that I really did not have a lot of skills of actually creating a setting for characters. And so you kind of see here, like I have a background implied. There's some sort of like broken down stone bridge with some vines and some spooky trees. This was kind of given to us as reference from the client. And as I started going into the render, things were looking clean and that was fine, but the image ended up feeling pretty barren and pretty still and a little tame. And so there really wasn't any sort of life all around. There wasn't really a whole lot of care put into the environment itself. And the character just kind of felt a little bit stiff the way it ended up being rendered. You can see over time, I'm starting to add in these kind of like cracks and stuff and facets onto the stone to make it feel a little bit more lived in, like there's a little bit more space here and there, but it's still pretty barren. This was a major pass that was done after a few rounds of feedback because yeah, it just ended up needing to be filled out like way more. So I just went through and like added a ton of overgrowth, a lot of leaves, a lot of roots, a lot of little bits of like stone here and there, just to try and get that setting to feel a little bit more lived in. If you guys saw my previous video on the lasso tool, you can also see like this is when I started kind of looking into the lasso tool and using it in my process. And if you'll remember, what I talked about is that a lot of the times when people first start using it, they end up having this problem of like constant crispness and a lot of crisp shapes without a lot of thought into edge control. And I was a huge victim of that on these. And so you can see a lot of the rendering here is not done super cleanly. It's a lot of like jagged shapes. Even here, as I'm starting to use it for some of this like messy like rock pattern, which isn't like bad. I think you can get away with doing that just fine, but it just wasn't designed really elegantly. And you can see as I'm starting to render, now I'm starting to push back against those shapes. I'm starting to kind of start to smooth things out, but it's smoothing things out that were already super sharp. And so I'm getting like areas like this that it doesn't really feel like the light and the shadow are actually cutting into each other and like the form is properly wrapping. And there's just issues with the drawing, like from the very beginning that didn't end up getting fixed, right? So like this foot coming towards us just feels weird and broken. And like it's like flat on the ground, but it's kind of awkward to be like flat on the ground when his leg is at this angle. It also looks way smaller than this foot over here. And it's not just because of the foreshortening. I think it's just like the shape and the space that's occupying in general just makes it look like it's way too small and it doesn't look anatomically correct. And you can see like little bits of like, I wouldn't consider like anatomy like this to be like really interesting or designed aesthetically well. And so it kind of ends up like having these two areas just sort of like meet in the middle. It feels like bulbousy and it doesn't feel great. And so at this point, you know, I already wasn't feeling great about this image, but you know, we're on a deadline. It's getting closer and I've got 8 other images that I had to try and also bring up to a similar quality bar, at least a similar quality bar. And so the pressure really started getting to me. And also around this time, you know, there's other people, I did half the images, but there were still the other half of images that needed to be done. So I was helping with feedback, with paint overs. There's a few images that I had to also kind of take over from other artists and try and bring those up to a more finished level. So it was just a lot of work. And when it came down to it, I wasn't as skilled as I would have, you know, hoped to be for taking on that much responsibility. So that project didn't go as we had hoped. And what ended up happening is The client didn't end up hiring us again after that for a while. We found out a little while later that, yeah, they weren't satisfied with the results. They explained why. So the majority of my images actually didn't even make it into the game because they just didn't hit the quality bar that was expected of us. Part of me kind of knew going into it, I kind of knew that I wasn't really hitting that quality that I think the client was expecting. The problem was, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and you can't see what you don't understand. And so at that time, when I was getting that work, I couldn't quite see what was wrong about it. I just knew I wasn't reaching this quality when I was looking at all these other images by these other like successful studios that were also working for Runeterra at the time. I could tell that what I was bringing to the table wasn't good enough, but I didn't have the skills necessary to be able to pinpoint that and fix my mistakes. But about, you know, a year after that first time of being offered work from them, they ended up reaching out to the studio again, and we got another shot. And so I ended up doing 2 more images for them. One of them was a Blood Doctor image that, again, I wasn't super satisfied with. I think it was more successful than some of my first images, but I don't think it was that successful overall. But I think this one, this was the Twin Blade Revenant, and I feel like this one was a pretty successful image. There's things still about it that I would adjust, but overall, I think it's a lot more solid storytelling. I think it's more solid drawing. You can see I'm making a lot more like deliberate decisions with how to actually design the drawing here. And after a year of having to do more illustration work, and especially after that experience of working on those first assignments, I definitely saw a lot of growth. I saw a lot of my mistakes, a lot of my pitfalls. And yeah, you know, really kind of had a fire going inside me to not want to have to experience that again. And so this was a huge learning curve. And if it weren't for having that opportunity to work on all those cards, even though it didn't really end up panning out and I kind of failed the project, it gave me just a ton of really like fast hands-on experience with learning how to make things quickly. So it increased like my rendering efficiency. It had me see how you can get to a final result faster. But in the end, I ended up turning in a decent image, at least. Not fantastic, but passable. I'll take that as a win. All right, and there you have it. There's some of my stories of my biggest blunders while working for clients. And I don't want this to discourage other people or maybe have other people be like worried that they're going to repeat the same patterns and have them just not try. That's not really the point of this video. I think the reason that I really like the idea of this video is because I feel like no one talks about this. And like, this happens all the time. Like, there's so many artists that I've talked to personally, behind, you know, closed doors or whatever in smaller meetings, that everyone's got their stories of how they messed up. And I feel like it should probably be talked about a little bit more often, because really when it comes down to it, a lot of us are just trying to be commercial artists. We're just trying to do a job, and not every job is going to go perfectly. And that's kind of the reality of the situation. It really sucks. I've definitely lost clients this way. I've also had clients that, you know, maybe understood that it wasn't, you know, my A game that I was bringing on this particular project, and they kept giving me a chance. I think it just helps to be transparent, be consistent with your work, and to try and understand what a reasonable level of effort should be for each individual client piece that you are working on. Hope you guys learned something from the video. If not, just, I don't know, yell at me or something. I won't see it, or I will, and I'll feel like really bad about it. As always, thank you everybody that has been watching, has been subscribing, been sharing it around. I mean, it's hard to express just how crazy it's been, how many people have actually been supporting me, and how many people have been just so positive about all the stuff that I've been making. So I really appreciate it. It's very encouraging. And yeah, it's making me excited to just sit down in front of a camera like this and talk about stuff. All right, now get out of my office. Bye. Going away now. Scooching away. Gotta do little scooches because I got wires on the ground. Gotta be careful. I can't scooch too much.